Thanks so much, Sanam. And those who know me know I've been waiting for this for a long time. So yeah, I am. It's funny, I am a little emotional. One of the reasons why is I think we find ourselves, I was thinking about this really great both. I love the series title and I love the session title, that accountability is not a metaphor and sweeping out the dirt under the mat. There's so much dirt under the mat that it's bulging. It gets harder and harder to stand on. It's hard to sit on. I'm 54 years old now. So I might be a bit calmer in, speaking and responding to some of these things. But I also was thinking that for me, like the rage is even deeper now. It's like little daggers, and that's okay. It's just that we then have to work out, what do we do with that? And we're dealing with just so much loss and damage now. There's so many people around me right now, for instance, just a practical example, who are suffering from vector-borne diseases, and there's just so much of it around, far more than we've ever dealt with. And as the trajectory of global warming continues, this is going to keep happening. And so we're doing, normal life goes on, everyday life goes on, but we're dealing with all of these changes to our ecology and to our bodies, and the way they interact. So, anytime there's commodification or marketization of development around me, or I feel the racism or directed at me or others, when we're facing like elitism and stigma, and there's all this geopolitical play that's always been there, but it becomes even heightened because people are in fear right now. It's not easy to handle without anger. So, and then, it's quite fascinating. Every day there's a new lesson in this. So I'm looking through this really global program of events, and then in the plenary that's being discussed on colonialism or coloniality, in the text we're being told to play nice, to call people in, not to call them out. And for me, that's where this begins, is if you cynically take space or you harm people in your work or your life or the system, then you're going to get called out. It's justice. And we seem to be doing more this set of work that says, yeah, call me out, but don't really call me out. Just do it in a nice way, do it in a kind way. We all need to be kind in our lives. But the problem is that this system and the people who are benefiting from it, they continue to do what they do. And for me, it's like grace comes with accountability. There's no growth without wisdom. So if you're going to get called out, you're going to get called out. That's part of life. And I think I find it very difficult to hear it when it's very, very close in our movements as well. Because just like any other movement, we're a mirror of, the world. So we have heterocapitalists, we have the panderers to patriarchy in our movement as everywhere. So that's tiring. And so this idea about accountability is not a metaphor. Well, neither is universality of human rights. We don't get to pick and choose who is right and who is not, who applies, and the same applies therefore to decoloniality. And the more that we think and we don't talk about our Pacific social structures, about the systems that are in place, about the ways we think, the epistemologies of this, particularly of this past 2 centuries, we really have been about what's come from the imperialist guns, germs, and steel period, right? We're not even close to opening up and dealing with our past and our present that comes from our past. We've got a school book in Fiji that illustrates it, Fiji, the Land and the People. It's so reformist, and yet it's the most popular book in education that we've had in Fiji. The last time I read it, it actually made me feel ill because there's nothing of any consequence in it that is about the reality of what we've lived through. But it's been taught in every classroom for decades since independence. So the next thing is about the way that we generationally carry on with these things, the local elites who formed the first 2 generations of our new countries. So now when things are bad and we need a shift, people call back to the old as if it's what we need. When really, often the new state is just really old, ugly flowers in a new vase. You know, this is the truth of it. We have some new beauty emergent, but it is often crushed by that which is old and we don't want to leave behind. We've had multiple coups over decades. They're still about, they've always been about patriarchy and racism and elitism. We learnt those through ancient and colonial times, and they're now then encoded in these capitalist and nationalist and fascist terms. Lots of weird kind of half well, I call them Frankensteinian institutions. They're a cross between kind of British stuffy white nonsense and then the new world toxic masculinist brown nonsense. And when they go, people feel nostalgia as if they were ours. But who are we? These people who are trying to kind of talk about justice and love, beloved community, and human rights for all. And if we want to undo it, it's such hard work, because the capitalism is the thing that leads, for instance, to one of our largest hospitals being privatized just now with no public fuss, a colonial sport that's so important that a convicted rapist is released by a government to play rugby games under the horrified eyes of everybody, especially feminists. The coloniality of the Judeo-Christian church, the way it has such hegemony in Fiji and the Pacific and the majority South. Well, the church came as an arm of the British Crown. In our case, it colonized in another way, and it left us with this really internalized cultural and social cringe and a really fear-based religiosity. And that results in homophobia and transphobia and in a lot of bigotry that we see today. As much as we have the beauty of who we are in the Pacific, we also have so much that is a guilt-inducing fear and intolerance, wiping away all of the beautiful fluidity that we've had in our gender systems, norming boundaries of woman and man, disappearing any of the gender diversity, cutting women's power, especially sexual and reproductive power, and leaving a masculinist fascism. When I look at the things that really kind of confound me today, it's 50% unmet contraceptive need, and maybe even more now through COVID. Women who work 3 to 5 times as hard as men every day on unpaid care, domestic and communal work. We've got some of our governments don't even have one woman in them. Outrageous that any Pacific government with no representation of half the population dares to call themselves democratic. But then when you look out at the world, you can say it's also outrageous that any government from the G7 and G20, including USA, UK, Europe, Australia, who refuses to change when the alternative is destruction of our biosphere, of the Holocene. It's insanity. And these governments protect and enable the 10% of elites of the world's rich polluting interests. They cause 50% of the world's carbon emissions. They protect BlackRock and Monsanto, the religious right, Big Pharma. They justify vulture capitalism, these unjust debts that everybody is having to pay now, even through a pandemic, when they refuse to share their technology and vaccines, much less climate finance with us. So we're very clear on the level of racism. So when they say that they're frightened about being held responsible, oh, we already hold you responsible. This is not a new knowledge. We know you and you know us. So we should get on with it. And I see people use the word fascist a lot now as we're, in the left movements. I want to substitute the word patriarchal because we have to know the source of the pain that we're going through. This is a masculinist war on ecological systems, from the smallest ecosystem to the planetary ecosphere. And yes, many of us as women, we're also implicated. But all men perpetrate these systems and they benefit. White men, older and educated most of all, but elite brown men too. And all men who treat women as unpaid labor and objects for power play and use. And white women too. Everybody benefits, even the halfway decent men. I've taught thousands of sessions of Sojisek over the years, and almost without exception, the first question from a man will be, what about the men who face GBV? So I repeatedly say on rote, the figures show that over 90% of the victim and survivors of intimate partner violence are women. Over 95% of the perpetrators of GBV are men. The structural violence of misogyny and patriarchy make these systems dangerous and deadly for all of us, worse for anyone who's seen outside these norms. So then we have to get into the conversation of what do you do personally? What about your construction of self as a man? How do you shift that? How do you work on both the material every day and the structural change we have to do? And we try and remind them that they're also hostage to capitalist heteropatriarchy. And then the last point maybe I'll make for now, Sanam and Viva, is about skin color politics. There's so many kinds. The ridiculous colonial phrases of Melanesian, Polynesian, Micronesian, as if it wasn't a racist French colonial invention to divide up the region. But there's a particularly awful manifestation in our region, white supremacy. It's alive and well here as elsewhere. Ask yourself how many rooms you're in where white people wear the salu salu, where they sit in the front reserve rows, where they take formal seating in regional conferences while the locals squeeze in the back, where they confidently take up space as if it's owed. How many executive officers and advisors still are white? So many. Of course, we contest it. We push our way in, we push our way through, we make our way to eyeline all of those who hold formal power, but that bears an intellectual, emotional, and action burden of resistance. It scars and it diminishes us over time, and it's tough the longer you've been doing it. For women, the leadership question is so tiresome and accountability is so low. Take PIFs in our region. None of the current senior management are women, not one. 2 other case studies. So many young white volunteers come into the region, do 2 to 3 years with a crop agency, go home, and then are leapfrogged to return as a regional advisor, leapfrogging right over the hardworking local with the excellent experience, the contacts, and the skills. Not understanding that your ease of movement in government spaces is a false signal that we still need help, that we are not capable of experimenting, of decolonizing, that we are not worth building in terms of our own capacities. I also think that expatriate culture itself is a way to dampen, to stop the revolution from beginning to take root, to keep the focus on development and not justice, not civilizational shifts. But the cloth is falling away from the eyes of many of us who work on economic, ecological, and climate justice, and we're determined to rip it away. Fast or slow, it's happening. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. There's a lot more. Thank you.